Good afternoon, everyone. This is Troy Schlicker of Reserve Realty here with the Austin Spotlight, and I'm joined today by Michael Barnes. How's it going, Michael?
I'm doing very well. How you doing today, Troy?
I'm doing well. Appreciate you taking the chance or taking the time to jump on the podcast and stuff with me. Michael is the CEO of Viva Equity Fund, and so we've had the chance to connect very briefly through some Facebook stuff that way, but kind of wanted a chance to bring him on and talk a little bit more about his journey here in the Austin startup and venture capital world. So again, appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just kind of kick off with a little bit of storytelling and let you take it from there, Troy.
Perfect.
I think a lot of people are curious about, how someone ended up in Austin. Are they that rare species of sort of native Austinite? I think I'm sort of a hybrid. My grandmother was born in Oklahoma. My mom was born in Dallas. And so Austin is kind of a natural progression south. But it took me a while to get here. I lived in 6 states growing up. Texas was one of them. And I spent about 4 years in Round Rock, Austin area in high school and late middle school, and ended up coming back to Texas after college. I'm a big service junkie, really big on impact in that regard. And so I actually took an offer from Teach for America to teach in the Rio Grande Valley, so even further south, Texas, and did that for 7 years and really loved the premise of helping students and their families, make a difference in their lives, right? And achieve something in terms of witnessing them unfold their potential. But there are these structural issues that show up when you try to go and just, be a great teacher, specifically in that context. And I ended up back in Austin getting my PhD and helping run a charter school to pay the bills, while I stepped back and contemplated the challenge of education in particular. When you're in a high poverty and diverse region like the Rio Grande Valley specifically, there's almost this trauma of poverty that can consume you if you don't have allies, if you don't have resources, if things like local parochial politics come into play and distract from student achievement. So there was this opportunity to come back to Austin and step back and say, okay, what can I do? And then my own educational background includes a master's in computer science. So already for fun, I had been helping nonprofits and even municipalities solve software and hardware problems like networking and websites and stuff like that. And so coming to Austin was a chance to surveil the landscape and also specifically work on social impact apps. And that was 2013. So that's where I'm kind of in the middle, right? I've been here in and around Austin for the better part of the last decade. And that journey was very exciting for me. So that's kind of my backstory. Yeah.
Very cool. Well, you mentioned kind of having a passion for service. Was that something you've always had kind of growing up as a kid, or something that you got more into later on in life, or where did that kind of stem from?
Yeah, I think I maybe had this sense, and I forget the philosopher that said it before, like Harry Potter, but with great power comes great responsibility. And I think
Spider-Man, I think.
Yeah, Spider-Man. I think there's been a few iterations.
Probably.
Yes. And basically, when I was growing up, I'm a white male with sort of an abundance of privilege and was affirmed by the education system as, gifted and talented, successful in arenas like speech and debate and even essay contests. So I had this sense that I could be a positive contributor to society. And personally, if I was just like serving my own individual needs, I might be off in a forest somewhere, appreciating nature, maybe on a stage in theater, which was a joyful experience. But I had this sense that if I just tried to find my own corner of the world, that the chaos of especially social and political discord might come around and eventually unsettle me, right? So I think climate change and global warming has a similar effect on societies across the globe. So I just had this sense at somewhere in the range of like 12 to 17 that I needed to go out there and serve, because otherwise we wouldn't have a world that I could enjoy. We inherit the space. We don't necessarily create the space we're born into. And so it just, was very top of mind throughout college. It was an opportunity to actually demonstrate a lot of that. I did some political organizing, community organizing, legislative organizing, and I really wanted to be a journalist, but that industry was so treacherous and unstable that I decided to go into teaching, and was very grateful for that stroke of luck and courtesy to Teach for America. So yeah, it was something ingrained in me. And and kind of a choice I made at a young age.
Yeah, you, which is awesome. You mentioned kind of dealing with the, again, being the teacher versus, one of the wonderful things is, the U.S. kind of pioneering the public education system for like, and like a lot of other well-off countries and stuff. And so that's awesome. On the flip side, because it's been run by states or local municipalities, like it's not necessarily always as efficient. Not that it should be as efficient, say, as business, but you have this interesting juxtapose of trying to make something that we do need it to be efficient, to be as effective as possible, but also there isn't the same type of business goals that you would have in a traditional business. How have you, you mentioned kind of with your computer science background, how have you kind of tried to meld those two worlds? Because like I say, it would be, in some cases, it would be easier to avoid that public arena and be like, oh, well, I can be profitable and do this and see this very specific outcome and get paid for it that way, versus a lot of people who go into teaching who unfortunately last for a very short amount of time because of all the resistance and challenges that it provides that way as well.
Yeah, exactly. So to the first part, definitely my 7 years in the classroom, which is longer than some and less than others, including my wife, who is in the classroom for more than 10 years. But it was definitely a very long sort of tour of duty in a challenging space, because every year I was more and more confident that students are resilient, that they're amazing, that their natural tendency is to grow, learn, and unfold their ability, if only the adults and their egos and their misguidance could kind of step out of the way and help facilitate what is actually, in my opinion, natural student tendency toward growth. And it's very tricky, because in the Rio Grande Valley, in which I looked at, there was explicit sort of racism and structural racism in the Jim Crow era. And when the community rose up and took power back for itself, it wasn't able to go back to any sort of indigenous or cultural form of community education. It inherited the system that we have, right? With state impositions like No Child Left Behind that constrain local decision making. State and federal, rather, conditions like No Child Left Behind and state testing that have maybe good ideas, like aspirations in mind, but actually constrain local control over the schooling environment. And you can't always do what you think is best for a child. And then that pressure starts to, disincentivize the right behavior in superintendents and principals. And everyone's focused on a sort of bottom line, which doesn't necessarily, it's like a one size fits none system, right? It doesn't quite fit anyone well. And you just talk to kids and they'll laugh if you just make a reference to school and whether it was a good experience. It's very difficult. And so that's the irony. Yeah, we've got America with plenty of wealth and plenty of spend per student comparatively around the world. You've got innovation in really small pockets like San Francisco Bay, and private schools and many other even magnet schools I've seen throughout the country have amazing innovations, but nothing is achieving scale there. And you're absolutely correct that I was in, traditional, local, public sector. I've worked for state and federal and nonprofit. And to some extent, I sought refuge in the private sector. I ended up in the private sector because it was simple. Are you there, Troy? All right, I'll just keep going. Okay, just making sure. I was like, wow, I'm in the window. Yeah. But basically, if in the private sector you create something of value and that generates revenue, you possess the revenue to help replicate the model. Whereas ironically, in nonprofit and in public spaces, you could do something amazing, and these lowercase p, like personal political forces that control the financing, can be yanked away from you, and really good models can be killed because you don't have sort of vertical control over the financing of what happens. So ironically, I ended up in private sector, to your point, as a way to test impact without having finances taken away if you succeed. And our first startup was called Teacher Talent, which helped solve recruiting and hiring for schools. And I can talk more about that as well. So.
No, like I say, it's interesting because I really do believe that in most cases, most people in like political, superintendents, federal government, state government, stuff like that, like they really do want to help kids and want to better stuff. Obviously, there's a wide spectrum of what's the best way to do that. And so that brings about its own challenges. But like you say, the a superintendent who now is graded on, pun intended, no child left behind, has a very different mindset in their day-to-day life than someone who's focused on each individual child. And not that they don't, most people, again, most educators, because that's how you generally go into the superintendents and principal roles and stuff like that, care about the individual kids, but it's just a very different juxtaposition of trying to care for each individual kid. But hey, my funding is based off this wide testing metric that, while important, doesn't really is too cookie cutter to really be right for everyone.
Yeah, and I know so many principals and superintendents and school board members and state leaders of school systems, so people that everyone else looks up to as such a powerful figure. But when you talk with them, what they feel is constraint. They feel all the ways in which they're unable to go and do just that one thing that their conscience says they should do. So I think it's really tough. It's easy to kind of say, well, I'd do it differently, or we should do it better. But if you haven't been inside that sort of hot seat of leadership, I think you don't see the irony that these really powerful and often very compassionate, caring leaders suddenly are shackled and constrained in ways, both maybe it's psychological, but also real sort of political and even sort of numerical functions that kind of constrain their ability to do well. And that's where, as unusual as it was in terms of my planning, it wasn't what I planned. I found this lane in private sector where both school and now housing were areas where I feel like we can make an impact, and they're actually correlated, right? That a lot of school challenges are tied to de facto sort of financial segregation of housing based on where you can afford to live. And in Texas, people don't know this, it's actually a felony to claim that you are zoned to a school that you don't reside in the territory of. So like, we've got these little fiefdoms where if you can't afford to buy into a certain school district zone, it's a felony to try and get your kid, into that educational opportunity.
And so, right. So for me as a realtor, that's something that I deal with a lot as well, where you get people that really want to be in a certain school district or, school district or even smaller middle school, high school, depending on either the perception of what those schools offer, the star scores, so in some cases the programs, which at that point I'm like, that makes more sense. As someone who grew up in a very small town, so you didn't have all the extra bells and whistles with a lot of different school things, I always kind of tell most of my clients that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a lot of cases, right? Like, so Westlake here in Austin is considered the top school district in the area and one of the best in the state. And yes, because it costs a lot of money to live in Westlake, there's more money that maybe goes to that school, which does help it provide more stuff. But in a lot of cases, the parents of the students put a premium on their kids getting a good education. And so therefore the kids get a better education because it's something that they're required to do. Where in a lower income area, if you have a single parent who now has to work 2 jobs, not that they don't want their kid to do well in school, but they have a harder time really enforcing that and sending their kids to maybe a tutor or being able to watch them do homework and help them do homework, right? And so is it the school district that's always the one that's making the students achieve what they're looking to achieve, or is it a lot of the other social and economic forces that kind of propel that, which then make the school look good as a side benefit?
We might have had a quick breakup there for a second.
You're back.
But I followed the logic, which is correct. There are certain districts where the resources, including time, right, as a luxury, allow robust PTAs and even private funding of special programs and opportunities that supplement public funding. And then there was this famous 2012 equity report in Austin that found that dollars that may have been allocated for special needs in East Austin, there's no compliance mechanism from the state. They actually feel powerless when they hand money over to a district. there's no confirmation that the funds flow to the specific purposes for which they're legislatively allocated. So money was just had a tendency to flow west, again, based maybe on parents being active and demanding things and asking for more. There was actually more funding for people on the west side of Austin ISD than the east side of Austin ISD. And you had to sort of do this like systems analysis because that data is not tracked or otherwise made manifest. But on the same time, there are amazing schools in Austin. The two I'm thinking of right now in particular are public schools that have beekeeping clubs that then make honey, that then they even sell at a market, have like test entrepreneurship, that partner with Top Golf for like golf programs, that have gardens in their, classrooms that are set up like little houses where they collaboratively work to tend to the needs of the home, including the garden, and even like, do the laundry when they make the sheets dirty from art class and stuff. So there are innovative models. And I think that's what we need more of, is people saying, what are my values? Test scores are a metric, but what are the values that you hold for your students? And I think that's probably it, is we just need more avenues for parent advocacy in part. Yeah.
That and what's the end goal, right? Like our education system now has been built really well in trying to get kids into college, which not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but there's a lot of kids who go into massive amounts of debt to go to college for a degree that doesn't get them a job that they want, a job that they don't even like, or two, a job that doesn't even pay the interest on their college debt. And so again, not that it's an easy thing to try and change an entire school system in a country, but right, like the end goal should be to one, it is definitely beneficial to have kids that can read well and do math and do have reasoning skills and social skills and all these other things that are just valuable on a day-to-day basis. But also it's about learning to do a skill to provide for yourself and your family, right? And so in a lot of cases, and I do think fortunately we're starting to see more of things like apprenticeships and trade schools, and some of those things become more in vogue, partially because you can make a lot of money to be an electrician nowadays because not a lot of people have gone into some of those different trade fields. But that it isn't just this one goal of getting kids to college, I think is another beneficial thing that hopefully continues to gain momentum, because it's not necessarily the best avenue for everyone, especially in the way that today's workforce works, and again with the debt that it accumulates for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think there are some things there where even if you go to college, how do you make sure that the environment is one that doesn't just kind of profit off of this train of students? And what happens is, if you look at the last few decades, the proportion of financing for a college education has shifted from state and federal sources to the individual student's debt load and or their parents' ability to pay. So we've shifted funding for higher ed on average from public sources to the individual students' resources. And if they don't have resources, obviously that means debt. So it's actually not even per inflation. We've just grown significantly the amount of debt we're expecting each student to shoulder. And I think about things like, why did it have to be 128 credits? Like, that seems super random. And I know in South Texas, and specifically the Rio Grande Valley, was one of the first to capitalize on dual enrollment programs that said, well, I can just take a slightly more rigorous high school course and dual my credit for high school and college and save myself my first year and even my second year and save the money and actually go invest in higher ed in the classes that are more exciting, that are more forward facing in terms of your career, and maybe get out in 2 years if I want, and still go get a JD or something, but actually be 2 years ahead financially and time wise. So I think there are hacks and maybe cracks in these structures, but certainly could do with a lot more pressure on the systems to change, I think.
Yeah, or even just the knowledge of it, right? So I actually didn't grow up in Texas, and so we did have some of those similar programs, at least starting when I was younger. I had younger siblings that took advantage of some of those kind of things to, again, basically take a year of college as a senior in high school, because it was a lot of similar coursework anyway, just potentially a slightly harder class, and in some cases probably not even that. But I also think, right, like what the school system was for me over 20 years ago versus if I were to have kids now who went into the school system. Like, yes, I'd have an idea of what it's like, but I get the chance to talk to parents and students occasionally, and I'm like, wow, that's a lot different than what I grew up with. And so even having some of those things, but really making it even aware of what some of those options are, I think are critical, because I think there are options that people would take advantage of if they really understood what's out there.
Yeah, and one silver lining, if we may, COVID obviously was a tragic plague, if you will, upon society and the world. It presented an opportunity to unify against a common threat, right? And I think, unfortunately, we doubled down on fractious politics and missed a huge opportunity to, rally our resources, as I think America has taken that opportunity in past times, right? And I'm sure there was dissent in each prior time, but there was almost groups that reveled in the dissent this time. People who probably know better and are doing so for their own political capital and other purposes. And I say that because, just as context, there is a silver lining in a sense that, there's an opportunity for education to be advanced in new ways, in ways that democratize access to high quality programs, virtual education, the sort of flexible models that had a chance to sprout. And I will say that in the private sector, in 2017, so I ended up coming to Austin in 2013. I got my PhD in education, policy, and leadership, which was that chance to step back and looked at the sort of systemic effects on education. And I also ran a charter school for 2 years and was working on, getting involved in entrepreneurship this whole time. Got to be kind of a student of entrepreneurship. And in 2017, I took a model that I had developed for our first customer, which was the charter school, around recruiting, gathering great data on recruiting prospects, and then marketing them and bringing them into a school so that you can have absolutely the right teachers, especially when you're taking on a hard challenge like creating a new school environment in a predominantly low-income area, right? You can't, take fresh teachers that are going to kind of cause students to struggle and suffer. You want almost like veteran teachers ready to jump in. So, but what I say is, when we launched that in 2017, the VC and funding landscape was, by thesis, hostile to education, especially K-12, right? It was 94 out of 100 angel and venture investors in the first 10 seconds of conversation would say, we don't do education, we don't do education. And there was just a small club that got oversaturated with demand. And if they already had a portfolio company, you were kind of shut out of a corner of the sector. And now, post-COVID, with all of the Zoom and related educational technologies taking flight, certainly in higher ed, it's hotter than ever. But even in K-12, I think there's more appetite for educational investments. So again, as a silver lining, there is this sense that we may be able to evolve new models. I think Texas, they did come in the third session just now and try and address funding for virtual, but they should have done it in the first session. That should have been priority number one, right? Is how do we lock in the long-term models that are going to come post-COVID that people aren't going to want to give up, for safety in the short term, because we're not done with COVID yet, but also long-term because flexibility in education just makes sense, right? So I think there's a lot of financial and sort of social political will to innovate in education right now. Texas probably didn't seize that opportunity as quickly as it could, but I think we still have that opportunity.
Sure. No, and unfortunately, like you mentioned, there's been a lot of instances in the last year and a half and even before then where it seems like the certain things that should be priority get kicked to the back burner for other ideological concerns or concerns that are going to benefit the people financially, right? Versus really what's in the greater good of the population as a whole, unfortunately. You mentioned that education's kind of one of the pillars that you've been working on and stuff. And I know with your Viva fund that also housing has been another kind of component with that. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you guys have been doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to draw a connection from one to the other, as I already indicated, where you live has a lot to do with the quality of your education, right? And in America, for decades, it's been referenced, your zip code kind of has an impact on your educational opportunity, your net worth, et cetera, right? These derivative functions, especially the zip code you're sort of born into and where you grow up. And there's also models like the community schools model that says, okay, well, school is important, but we need to look at the whole family context, the living context, the home situation. And in education, you see a lot of mobility issues with unstable housing. You see when somebody is on the edge of or even becomes homeless, that obviously affects their education. So I already did have some exposure to housing. In fact, in my PhD program, I kind of thought that like housing is the one lever that all of the education policy I had focused on wouldn't touch, and therefore we could only make so much impact. Especially because housing is not just about where you live and your proximal access to opportunities, but it is the single biggest driver of an average American's net worth, right? Especially home ownership specifically, and having that asset. And so that's kind of a dividing line in wealth gaps and equity gaps, both financial and social equity gaps in America. So the precursor to this is in 2017, we created a startup called Teacher Talent. We went out to do one thing, which is to create an HR platform to go out there and find the best teachers, market to them, and then find the best fit schools so that they stay in education and don't quit. A lot of teachers think that there's not, they only know their own four walls of their classroom and their school. They're not aware that they could be in a lot of different environments. Like in the private sector, people are always shopping. They're always having drinks with recruiters and being hit up. In education, that certainly wasn't the case in 2017, and it's still pretty much not the case today. So we built a platform, and we did go and the other 6 out of 100 investors, including Techstars, supported us in putting together a few $100,000, which meant we did it on the cheap. And we built a platform that when we unlocked the revenue challenge of being kind of an end-to-end solution, sourcing data all the way through hire, which is very different from the tech sector. We have all these little niche partners that help you on your journey. We were able to unlock our pricing, and we soared to almost 200,000 per month in recurring revenue, which was insane. And then we exited to a company that could help us capitalize, get my starving entrepreneur salaries in healthcare. And today, because of what we started, thousands of schools across America have access to high quality tools that help them find the best fit campus. And we still continue to keep an eye on our efforts there, but we sort of had a mission accomplished moment. I think that was very powerful. And then what that does to somebody who was a service junkie and working in low income communities as a teacher is, the influx of capital gains and wealth that you now possess, even if it's not impressive to a sort of West Coast, unicorn exit, it can make a significant difference with the founders and the communities that I personally had been working in. So we took those capital gains and we started advising and investing in other diverse teams pursuing social impact ventures, specifically with a focus in the Austin area. And some of those have gone on to a lot of success with a little bit of seed capital and support. They also have gotten into top accelerators and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not in a few cases, about $1 million. So that was just like, okay, we did something. And while I'm in my sort of NDA period of transitioning our technology to, the future vehicle, let me share back right away. Let me give back to the community what I've gained on this journey. But then there's also that thought of, okay, now what can I do next? Mm-hmm. And I think that's how we got to housing. It actually started all the way back in 2017 in Kansas City, Missouri, where I was there for Techstars. Was the program we got into because of the timing. And I was riding with an investor in an Uber. And I was thinking, just like we have the ability to not own a car and have this shared ownership model of cars, so to speak, cars on demand, at some point in the future, I believe there would be housing on demand, right? That people would want to be able to say, I feel like living in Seattle for 3 months. Or I feel like living in Boulder, Colorado for 6 months, or, Tampa Bay, Florida, or, Barcelona. And so this idea that at some point millennial demand, which as a realtor, I'm sure you've seen that like parents' houses and even some of the McMansions, again, Austin aside and the recent real estate boom aside, there are a lot of like larger homes that people don't want to inherit from their parents. They don't want that sort of possession to possess them. And they want to be what I would call both digital domestic nomads. So digital domestic nomads, as well as the classic, nomads that we see traveling the world and posting Instagram stories every day, especially post-COVID, people are saying, I can live anywhere. Now, again, we thought about this in 2017. Again, COVID being an accelerator of this trend with the push for remote, full-time remote opportunities. Why not be able to use an app to pause your current lifestyle and start somewhere else on demand? And so that was the first inkling. What we also discovered from 2017 through 2020 was that while this may be attractive to millennials and tech workers and people with affluence like Elon Musk, who just sold all of his houses and is now living a sort of nomad lifestyle in Austin and the Rio Grande Valley down there in Boca Chica with SpaceX. It also is a potential opportunity for affordable housing, because what we thought was, well, if people are going to be moving between one house and another, it's almost like if you and I owned this broad housing network, we'd want to get a derivative stake in the underlying portfolio, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea is, what if you could dynamically choose your house from among this network and still have a percentage of your rent, in that context, go into an investable fund that grows over time, like a mortgage, kind of a simulated mortgage, if you will. And so that's literally what we decided to build and did research in 2020, and are kind of still stealthily soft launching, even though we have our platform and our first houses in the network and our first families in the network. We realized this is very powerful because someone with low income can build wealth from what traditionally would have been a renter model, because they can have access, they can have relative affordability, and they're working hard, but now a piece of that rent goes into an investment fund that builds over time. And I think that appeals to a few different segments in the market.
Yeah, no, it's, definitely been, probably the two biggest things that I've seen in the year and a half with housing, right? One, like I think a lot of people were initially caught off guard with how much home prices ramped up, right? And it really, all it was initially a little stall of like, what's actually going to happen with being stay at home and stuff. And then it was kind of the natural, well, if I'm going to be stuck here, I'd much rather be stuck here with more space. So you have all the people moving from studio apartments in New York City to a place where they can actually, walk around and stuff. But that rise in home prices has, while it's unfortunate if someone now the home that they wanted to buy for $800,000 is now $1 million, and maybe they can't afford it, so they have to get a little bit less house. But it does put the most pressure on the first-time home buyer, because in Austin, the first-time home buyer was maybe able to find something in the $250,000 range that now is over $300,000, and for a lot of them, they can't afford that difference in price, and so it makes getting into a home, which has historically been one of the best ways for someone to build wealth, because it's kind of that automated savings plan and stuff. Has made it that much more challenging. We do, at the same point in time, we do see a lot more people who are like, hey, I can Airbnb or VRBO a bunch of different places to live for a month or two at a time, 90 days at a time, as long as that flexibility is allowed. And it'll be interesting to see how that continues to progress, as some of the biggest companies in the US have kind of said that employees will be able to stay remote indefinitely. But the more data you start to get, the more it seems like that may not really be the best way for a lot of these companies potentially to work long term. Not that they'll ever truly probably go back to hey, no, come into an office 9 to 5, 5 days a week, but that there may have to be some balance in order to really get the best productivity. Because one of the factors that I think a lot of people didn't necessarily take into effect when they said, yeah, just work remotely forever, is that a lot of these teams who were working remotely in 2020 were teams that already knew each other and had these in-person bonds prior to going virtually, where when all you do is go virtually and just, you don't have those smaller interactions of talking at the water cooler or going to lunch together or some of those kind of things, it's hard to virtually replicate those and build that trust and build those connections. And so it'll be interesting to see how that continues to progress going forward. Again, no part of me believes that we're going to really see a workforce that's the same way it was in 2017, but I don't think we all completely understand exactly what it'll be like in 3 years, assuming that we can truly get past the COVID side of things and having to, be as isolated as we kind of need to be these times.
Yeah, I think a lot of us looked at models like Zapier, which, was probably one of the earliest to do fully distributed teams, no central office. And I used to call it sort of the underdog, but recently I think it got valued at $5 billion. So it's kind of finally posted at a valuation that sounds about right. And I love the tool. But, their culture was one that figured out and unlocked some of the secrets to decentralized work. And when I was planning for the Viva team in particular in early 2020, like just pre-pandemic, my vision was, decentralized, distributed, especially with housing, right? You're going to need some regional presence when you're attached to the actual asset, the underlying asset. And also, though, strategic retreats, right? To your point, having touch points and opportunities for teams to come together, and then broader company-wide gatherings to come together. And then also like, okay, well, work from home sounds nice, but home is not always the best place to work. So sort of co-working allowance and looking at more decentralized co-working structures where it's smaller clusters. I think there was an opportunity missed in the, and it's probably not missed, it's probably still there, in the like absence of a robust commercial leasing appetite, during and immediately post-COVID. I think co-working could say, well, why don't we decentralize and offer little co-working hubs, or just turbocharge some coffee shops, right? But if you calling booths in coffee shops and give them a sticker that says they're part of the Passport Club, co-working passport. And I think there's going to be those models that come about. I always get impatient with the pace, given all the entrepreneurship, the pace of innovation in some of these niches. It's like, I just need like a bench of founders. And, and then I think the capital would be there, but even a wall of capital would be like, okay, you take this, go, test it out, and you help them out, right? So I think it's funny that founders are all in their vectors, but there are these niches that should probably be tackled.
Yeah.
But if we do that, it's an interesting one where people are choosing where they want to live, not being compelled. Yeah.
No, and I think, too, that's one of the things that I don't deal as much with the commercial space, but they had heard there that, like, obviously how those spaces get used will be different, but that it might not, like, I think for a lot of people, the initial thought was, oh, there's going to be just this run on foreclosures in the commercial space, but not necessarily, because, right, if you used to work at Google and you had this 6 foot by 6 foot cubicle, well, now they're going to make it a 12 by 6 foot cubicle, so you don't have to be as close to your neighbor when you don't need to be. And now half the people will come in Monday and Wednesday, half will come in Tuesday and Thursday, or you'll switch weeks. And so there's just a lot of different ways that work will look like in the future as well. The other interesting component with that too is it's now, like you mentioned about with teachers, and it's probably not something that can be used as effectively with teachers, because that does seem like it's going mostly back to in person. But you now are like, oh, well, it used to be, hey, we need someone from Austin to fill this role. And now if really the best person to fill this role is in Kansas City, yeah, you can work remotely, and you fly in, or we fly in, or however that is, for a week a month, or a week a quarter, and to have that in-person side of things. But other than that, we'd much rather have a higher quality person, even if you're not necessarily local. And so that is another component that will kind of change the workspace, as well as then obviously housing and real estate going forward as well too.
Yeah, if Texas had approved financing for virtual education in the first legislative session versus the third before the start of school, I think we would have seen a much more dynamic set of choices. But again, politics kind of trumps appetite for innovation there, perhaps. And they got to it later, and so maybe it'll just have a slower upswing. But there is a company that I got to know in time that was based in Austin and then had an exit, which was focused on this idea of, why do we have to have a great calculus teacher in every hamlet in America, right? Specialized people, you can have the best sort of be multi-purpose across multiple districts or campuses or classes, and they can be remote. And then what you have are sort of facilitators, people who are really good at working with students and getting them motivated and keeping them focused, right? which is, certainly more than 50% of a great teacher's job. And maybe they also teach classes, but the idea is you could start to differentiate specialized content instruction, direct instruction specifically, from people who are there to help students facilitate on the ground.
Sure.
So
at that point, you'd have more of an in-person tutor to actually help those people that need help with that specific subject, and right, and or again, right, I mean, that it would also get to my bigger point of how changing the curriculum. Like, there's probably a lot of kids who take calculus because it looks good for a college entrance exam who will never need calculus in their life, and I was one of them, and I don't ever use it. And so, yeah, it's just, but yeah, right. Like you could, a class like that and some other classes, you could have a much larger virtual class to kind of get the subject matter to the students that way, and then have more personalized help for what's needed and the time. And again, similar to having the workspace forced different that way too, you could have similar with schools of, again, we definitely want kids to go to school and have the social aspect, because that's one of the most important things about going to school. But it could be potentially having some, a certain amount of classes remotely, a certain amount of, days remotely, and different things to help also prepare kids for real life, because that's how real life's going to be going forward as well.
Great. Well, I maybe to wrap up, I can talk a little bit more, and I'd love to hear your reflection on, since you are a realtor in Austin and a real estate agent, and we're kind of coming out of stealth with Viva, just kind of pitch you the premise and hear your initial thoughts, especially with respect to the Austin area. So what we do is we, take, investors in real estate, and right now we're acquiring the property, so it's vertically integrated so that we can build a really rock solid model before using sort of like third-party landlords. But, take investor money, acquire real estate, have this portfolio of homes, multifamily, some single family, because people do aspire for that kind of American dream lifestyle. And then, the renters, by being good renters and having good, community standards upheld, get a percentage of their payment, and it's market rate, not forced savings, but they get a percentage of their payment set aside each month, which right now is 8%. And that goes into an investment fund. So then they can become an investor in the portfolio if they so choose. So kind of that shared ownership model. And we're, over the next 30 days, producing some and releasing some case studies that show if you were to do this for 30 years, you could build the equivalent of the value of a home that you were to buy without a mortgage, without any debt, and with the flexibility that rent affords, and a little bit more liquidity than a house typically affords.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting concept. Again, back 20 years ago when I was in school and renting the one of the places that me and some friends rented, they actually would put some money towards, if you wanted to, when you were done with your lease, towards specifically buying a home. Like, so you had to then go buy a home. And obviously at that point in time, as kids just out of college, none of us were in that stage of life. So it was money that that we never were able to take advantage of. So this way, the fact that it's something that they get to reinvest into a fund like this is a very cool concept, and I think would also help differentiate some of the other types of corporate landlord trusts and stuff that are out there. Because, right, there's obviously it's a interesting juxtapose for someone like me, again, going back to the people that have been hurt the most by the rising prices, which are just, market forces, which I'm, generally all in favor of market forces, but it does hurt that first time home buyer. And so we have nationwide, especially, all kinds of different renters buying up, rental properties because they see it as a great long-term investment, which unfortunately then hurts that first time home buyer, but you're not going to stop it. And so having this as as a way to, for someone who either just needs to rent because they can't afford to buy, or, like you mentioned too, someone who wants to rent because they want the mobility and the flexibility. And that's something that I talk about as a real estate agent too. Like, yeah, I would, if it was me and I knew I was going to live in Austin for the next 5 years, I would still buy now. The market is not going to see a drop in value anytime soon. But if you want that flexibility because, hey, if you think a shutdown is going to happen and now I'm going to work remotely in some place in Utah because it's even cheaper than Austin. Like, hey, there's definitely something to be said for having that flexibility of being able to move and live that kind of nomadic lifestyle. So it sounds like a cool concept as a way to help let people have that benefit of still renting, but that potential for wealth creation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think there are probably some market forces that are encouraging people, it's kind of like volatility. Like there are a lot of people who profit off of the shorter lifespan of a mortgage and the shorter lifespan of a homeowner. And it's hard to constrain those forces. So if we're holding assets continuously and letting people switch between them without having to make a buy-sell transaction every time, you kind of allow for a little bit of the oxygen to get taken out of that sort of accelerating effect, because with every transaction, if the house has to go up in value by 20%, it's going to find a way. People are going to want to get paid, and people are going to want to make their money every 2 years instead of every 7 years, if that's the average transaction time. 5 is kind of like right in the middle.
Yeah, no, very much so. How would people find out more about that program and stuff for you guys?
Yeah, so our website is viva.fund. We've made it simple to kind of put up the value prop. And we've got a wait list. We've got some initial units. If you click through and sign up, you'll get access to our list of properties as well. We've got a wait list that's sort of right there on the page, and excited to grow our opportunities in Central Texas and throughout Texas initially, given kind of the unfair advantages of starting where you live. And as well, since we're here and we're live, just email me at michael@viva.fund. So have at it, and excited to talk to people. And really what I'm really inspired by is, especially in Austin and the surrounding area, there are a lot of people that maybe they have capital, maybe they're investing in real estate, maybe they're a fund that's pretty big, but people are very passionate about solving these problems. There is a tremendous amount of goodwill around how do we solve these problems so that we don't just make money, but also help build society through housing development.
No, I definitely think that it has been a shift from the Gordon Gekko 1980s greed is good mentality to yes, ambition is good and doing that is good, but there's ways to do that benefit even more people as well too. So that's awesome that you guys are kind of taking that tact as well.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you, Troy, and look forward to talking to you more about what you do. And thanks for having me on here today.
I appreciate it, everyone. Hopefully everyone has a great day.